Okay, last week I ran out of time to finish the Q&As that I had saved here. There are lots of really great sourdough questions, but before I get started, I'm going to clean off my glasses because I got a really nasty message last week from a guy named Brad that my glasses are dirty. How's that, Brad? It's not talked about much, cleaning tips and keeping your drains from clogging. I usually just keep a big bowl of hot soapy water in my sink and I just put my sourdough tools in there. The sourdough bits will dissolve into the hot soapy water. And before I pour that hot soapy water down my drain, I stir it all up so that it's completely dissolved and there's no like big bits of starter or dough. Some people take that a step further and they will take that big soapy water bowl and they will pour it outside into the grass or into their plants or their garden. Supposedly sourdough is good for that, but maybe the soap, I don't know. If I don't have a big bowl of soapy water in the sink already, I'll just use a paper towel and wipe off my spatula and then put the paper towel in the trash. I don't take it as serious as some people do, but then again, maybe my drains will clog and then I'll regret it. What does a high hydration dough mean? Does it just have more water in it? Yes, high hydration just means that there's a larger percentage of water compared to the flour. Anytime we're talking about hydration, it's always a percentage of water to flour. So easy example, if there's 1,000 grams of flour and 700 grams of water, it's a 70% hydration because 700 is 70% of 1,000. In my opinion, about 80% or higher would be considered a high hydration dough. I'm confused about the difference between Levain and feeding your starter. It is confusing because it's two words that materially mean the same thing. We are referring to feeding your starter to get it nice and active and bubbly, but the intention between a Levain and just feeding your starter is what's different. A Levain is you are preparing starter the exact amount of grams that you need for a specific recipe that you have in mind. You've planned for this. The entire jar is your Levain, and you will use all of that in that jar for your recipe. If you are just feeding your starter, there's no real intended purpose necessarily. You're just feeding it to keep it alive and to maintain it. You may or may not use it in a recipe if you're not a good planner. This would be me. I don't ever make a Levain, ever. I just feed my main starter, and if I do have a recipe planned in mind, I will make sure I have enough grams for that recipe plus a little bit so that I'm not scraping everything out of the jar. There's going to be a little bit left at the bottom to feed to use again next time. So it's really, we're talking about the same thing. A Levain and feeding your starter both will produce an active, bubbly, happy starter. It's just what you plan to do with it, and that's why the words are different, which is probably why it's so confusing because it's like it's the same thing, but it's like same but different. Autolyse, can you talk on this and how it super strengthens your dough? So an autolyse is when you mix your flour and water together first and let that sit for a while. Usually I would say a minimum of like 30 minutes. Most common would be probably about an hour, but you can even go up to overnight. What's happening is the water is fully hydrating the flour and it's starting to create those gluten bonds. And a really beautiful thing is even before you add your starter and salt, you can do the window pane test, which is stretching a little piece of dough out and seeing if you can see light shining through it without the dough tearing. And that is a sign of a very strong dough. And you can achieve that through an autolyse. So it's kind of like doing a ton of good work without much from you. All you have to do is mix the flour and water, but it is an extra step. And as someone who shares sourdough recipes, it's kind of difficult sometimes because you want to be picky and choosy about how simple do I want this recipe to be versus how good will it turn out. And it's a tough balance because if there are too many steps, people get turned off by that. And they're like, you're making sourdough too confusing. But then it's like, but the autolyse is so amazing. So do I add that extra step in at the risk of people saying this is too complicated? It's a personal choice. So most of us that do recipe development include it as like an optional step, but I highly recommend it if you have the time. It's not going to make or break your bread, but it will make it very, very strong. So if you have issues with your dough being very weak or slack or not being able to retain nice, beautiful bubbles, consider trying an autolyse. It's like a hack, in my opinion. Why do so many people with sourdough Instagram pop bubbles on purpose when shaping? There's a lot of reasons for this potentially, and not all of them are considered bad. What I think you might be referring to is when you laminate the dough, which isn't really the proper term when it comes to like, this makes pastry chefs really mad. Just Google laminating and you'll see why. But what I'm talking about is when you do the pre-shaping or the final shaping and you stretch your dough ball out into a really wide rectangle, very thin dough, and then you continue like folding it with the book and then rolling it up and final shaping it, but for no reason, like you're not adding inclusions like a cinnamon sugar thing, you're just stretching it out and rolling it up for a plain loaf. That was like a trend that was started from one YouTube video during the pandemic. A lot of people saw that video and thought that that was a step you had to do when making sourdough, including me. That's what I saw on social media, so that's what I did. But after a while of doing it, you kind of have this realization to yourself of like, why am I doing this? I understand it's part of the steps that I saw someone else do, but what's the why behind it? And that's part of why I became so obsessed with sourdough is I am the kind of person that wants to know the why behind everything, especially when it comes to cooking. I don't want to just read a recipe and have it say do XYZ without knowing what is that contributing to the final result. And so I just had that internal question of like, what's the point? And when I started researching and going down the rabbit hole, I realized there is no point. It was a fad. This is silly. You're just popping all those beautiful bubbles you've developed during the bulk fermentation. And now your bread's not going to be as airy or as fluffy or have as much of an oven spring as it could have if you would have just been a little more gentle. That said, some people do purposefully pop some bubbles. If you see a massive bubble, you might want to pop that because it could lead to an awkward air pocket in your dough. But we definitely don't want to on purpose like smush all the bubbles. I also sometimes see people when they do their final shaping, they will pop any bubbles on the surface. This is something that I believe the sourdough mama does. She is very good at very intricate scoring designs. They're gorgeous. But she needs a clean blank surface in order to make these really intricate patterns. So I've seen her use a little toothpick to pop any bubbles on the surface so that they don't mess up her design. So that's a choice with a purpose behind it. I probably talked about that too much, but hopefully that answers your question. My house is too cold. Everything gets very slow. How can I calculate the time? So dealing with a cool house has its pros and cons. Pro being you can do lots of things overnight, which I love. The timing of it just works good. Usually in the mornings, like I'm making lunches for the kids, I'm getting in like that work mindset. And I don't necessarily want to be in the kitchen like putting a dough together and babysitting it. But at night, I'm already doing the dishes. Maybe dinner's already going. I'm in the kitchen. Things are out. Like it's a perfect timing for me with a family to just throw some dough together. I'm already here. I'm already doing this. So I love that around dinner time, putting a dough together while we're like watching TV and there's a commercial. I can pop in the kitchen, do a stretch and fold, and then I can just leave that dough on my counter while I'm sleeping and then attend to it when I wake up. If you have a cold house, this is lovely. You can just do any regular sourdough bread recipe. You're not going to have to adjust how much starter is in it. Don't worry too much about the temperature of your water, and it'll probably be just fine. I just adjust how much starter I put in the recipe to either slow down or speed up how long the bulk fermentation will take. And part of that is trial and error. I wish I had a perfect timeline to give you, but your starter is unique. Even though you're saying your house is cold, I'm sure the temperature of it is shifting now and again. There's a lot of variables, the humidity in your house, the type of flour you're using. I think in general, you're going to have to experiment. Put together a regular loaf of sourdough bread with just a very standard recipe, like 500 grams flour, 350 water, maybe 100 grams of active starter, 10 grams salt, mix it together, do a couple stretch and folds, and then let it sit on the counter overnight while you're sleeping and check it in the morning. And then potentially just move forward with it. And then after you finish the bake, you can look at the crumb and say, okay, it's a little bit underproofed. So next time I'm either going to add a little bit more starter, maybe 125 grams instead of 100, or I'm going to let it sit out even longer. So maybe I put my dough together earlier in the evening or shape it later in the morning. Honestly, the best thing that I've ever done is to stop reading recipes and doing it to a T and wondering why didn't mine turn out like theirs? Sourdough isn't like that. There's too many variables. So you start with a recipe as a starting point, and then you can experiment in your house and make little tweaks until you find something that is repeatable and works well in your environment. If you don't want to deal with a cold, you can invest in certain equipment that will keep your dough and your starter warmer. I'm experimenting right now with the Goldie from the brand Sour House. It's like a little home for your starter, and it keeps your starter between 75 and 82 degrees at all times, which is the perfect temperature for yeast. It makes them very happy. So that is a potential solution. Broad & Taylor also has a very popular proofing box that you can put your bowl of dough in, and you can set the temperature. So those are very nice tools to have if you're really just fed up with dealing with a cold house, but you are going to have to put some money into it. There's cheaper ways to go about it. You can get scrappy and make some makeshift things. Feeding your starter off of feel, or should it always be measured out? This is personal baker's preference. How do you want to go about feeding your starter? What's your attitude like? What's your mood? I change all the time. If I really want to be specific about when my starter is going to peak, I will measure it with intention. I really like a 1:5 feeding ratio because that works really well with timing in my house. If I feed it in the evening, it'll be peaked when I wake up in the morning. And if I feed it in the morning, it'll be peaked around dinner time. And those are the two times where I'm most likely ready to make some dough. So in that case, measuring it is nice because then I know in my house, it usually takes 10 to 12 hours for it to peak at that ratio. If I am not feeling so specific, I don't have anything planned, I just don't want my starter to die on my counter, I might just go by feel. And in that case, I have an entire article on my blog about how to eyeball sourdough starter feedings. It's very simple. You just pour out almost all of the starter that's in your jar and leave whatever clings to the sides of the jar in the bottom. Put in a nice scoop of flour and enough water to get a thick pancake batter consistency. It doesn't have to be complicated if you don't want it to be. When to steam versus not steaming during baking. So in the first part of baking, you want your bread to steam so that the crust doesn't set before it's been able to fully expand. That's what we mean when we talk about oven spring, is your bread was able to expand to its full ability before the crust set. And that is what we're going after. So that's why when we use a Dutch oven, it's covered for the first half, or in my case, I like to do like 2/3, 3/4 of the bake so that it's fully expanding. And then we take the lid off and let the crust set. If you're doing open baking, you would just put something that creates steam in your oven, like ice cubes in a hot cast iron pan. Some people use lava rocks. Some people use a soaking wet kitchen towel. Create that steam and leave it there for the first 20, 30 minutes of your bake, and then take it out so it's not steamy in there and your loaf can harden and set. Favorite lamb? I've tried lots of different bread lambs. My favorite, I think, is the UFO bread lamb, the circular one. It's very easy to use. I had 2 of them, but I gave them away, one to my mother-in-law and one to my mother. So I don't have any more right now. I should probably buy another one because it is my favorite. But I am trying, like testing out another one from the brand Seville, I believe. And it is a handle one, and it's really heavy and durable, and I really like it. So is it my favorite one? I don't know. I haven't used it enough and done like enough scoring designs to really be able to say, but so far, so good. How do you store loaves that won't be eaten right away? If it's going to be a little bit, like more than 3 or 4 days, I would go ahead and slice up the entire loaf and put it in a freezer Ziploc bag and put it in the freezer. Bread comes back from the freezer beautifully. I usually just take it out frozen and put it straight in the toaster frozen, and it'll be good to go. Autolyse versus Fermentolyse. Maybe as an idea for a separate video. I could make a separate video, but it really is simple, the difference. Autolyse is just flour and water mixed together, and it's going to sit for a little bit before you move on. Fermentolyse is flour and water and starter all mixed together, and then you're going to delay adding the salt. So it's really just a matter of, is your starter included in that little mix or is it not included? And by the way, I like both. Some people ask me, which one do you prefer if I could only choose one? I like doing both. I don't usually recommend doing both because it's 2 extra steps and it's a lot of mixing. Your arms will hurt, which is why I've been experimenting using the stand mixer for this. I love the Autolyse because of the dough strength that it provides. I love a Fermentolyse because it really speeds up bulk fermentation. So I do like both. Don't make me choose. Does the amount of stretch and folds really matter? Sometimes 2 to 3 are enough. It doesn't really matter. It's difficult to answer because the number of stretch and folds that you will need depends on the process that you're using. If I do an Autolyse, I need less stretch and folds than if I didn't do an Autolyse. So you might have 2 different recipes. One has an Autolyse, one doesn't. One calls for 2 to 3 sets of stretch and folds. The other one calls for 4 to 5. The difference between those is from the dough strength. What we're trying to do is strengthen that dough, and also stretch and folds are good for regulating the dough temperature and making sure all of the ingredients are properly dispersed. If something didn't get mixed in well we're giving it an opportunity to make its way around the dough. I think it's a matter of feel. The more you work with dough, the more you'll understand when it's fully strengthened and when it might need a little extra help. You can do the window pane test to get an idea for that, but the more that you make bread, and especially if you do an Autolyse and feel what very, very strong dough feels like, you'll kind of be like, okay, this is the last stretch and fold. It's not going to need another one. Specific timing of making sourdough when working full time and being a mom. It's hard. It is hard. It really is, especially if you're not working from home. Sourdough is a bit easier for me, even though I work full time and have a million things going on, because I work from home. I know people say, sourdough takes so much time, and it does take time, but not hands-on time. Like, I can be writing an article at my desk and pop up and do stretch and folds in the kitchen for literally 60 seconds and then go back to my desk. Sourdough isn't time consuming. You just need to be available to do it. So in your case, I'm just assuming that you're going into an office. So what I would do if I were you is in the morning, first thing, I'm going in the kitchen and I'm feeding my starter a 1:5 feeding ratio. How many grams of starter flour and water you're using just depends on how much starter you need for your recipe. A pretty standard thing might be 25 grams starter, 125 grams water, 125 grams flour. That might be too much. You can scale it back. That's the beauty of a ratio. And that's going to peak by the time you get home from work and from getting all the kids and everything. When you're making dinner or after you're done making dinner and cleaning up, you're going to put your dough together. Because you're busy, we're not messing around with Autolyse or Fermentolyse. We're keeping it simple. So you're going to mix together all of your ingredients, flour, starter, water, salt, get it really nicely incorporated, cover it, let it sit. Every 30 to 45 minutes, even 60 minutes, it's not that serious. Just pop in when you think about it. I have to set a timer or I will forget, but it's not like it has to be 30 minutes to the dot. Pop in the kitchen and do a few stretch and folds and then cover it, and do that maybe 4 times if you can, and then just cover it and let it sit on your counter overnight while you're sleeping. If you have a cold home, you don't need to adjust the recipe you're using at all. I'm sure it'll be just fine. If you have a warmer home, use ice cold water when you're mixing your dough together and use maybe half the amount of starter that the recipe calls for, and use that as like a starting place. And then after you make your bread, you can make adjustments either way, depending on if it's under or over fermented. So that's going to do its bulk fermentation on the counter overnight while you're sleeping. When you wake up in the morning and you're like getting your kids up or you're getting ready to hop in the shower, turn your dough out on your counter and do a quick pre-shape. It takes like 30 seconds, and leave it uncovered and go do what you got to do. Make kids lunches, get them up, do your hair, whatever. After about 30 to 40 minutes, come back in the kitchen, get out your Banneton, do a little catty clasp, takes 10 seconds, stick it in the Banneton, stitch it a little bit, cover it, and put it in the fridge. And don't even think about it until you get home from work that evening, and then you can preheat your oven and bake it. This is what I would do if I was not working from home. If I was at an office, that is pretty much the exact routine that I would do. And I would do 2 to 3 loaves at a time so that I have more bread on deck. If you're very busy, prep multiple loaves at the same time because you don't have to bake them all at the same time. They can just chill in your fridge till you're ready to bake them. And I found up to 4 days is fine. So you can do this even though you're busy. I promise most of it is hands-off work, and you can simplify the process to make it work for you. Would your bread be a little bit better if you did an Autolyse or some of those extra steps? Sure. But if you're a busy working mom with hungry kids and husband, I don't think you're going to care about the 5 or 10% lift in improvement that you would get from those extra steps. Just keep it simple. How to create a contract for collaborations/affiliations. So I don't really do much of this for the sourdough count. Brands just don't want to pay creators. They want us to create advertisements for them for free, or they'll be like, well, if you make the video, then you can get commission. It's still time and effort and work planning to put together a video promoting a product. And I'm not going to do that if you're not going to pay me. I will still talk about your product when it fits, when I'm using it and someone says, hey, what's the link to that product? Or if it's just a natural thing, like I'm testing something out for the first time or reviewing it, but I'm not going to go out of my way to create a commercial for you. I don't know why brands think that it's okay to ask for that. It's crazy. And if you are saying yes to brands that are asking this, stop. Anyway, so I don't really do that much in the sourdough space because no one has a budget to pay creators. I did do this in my previous blog. It was a mom blog, and brands were happy to pay for me to create content, reviewing their products, testing them out, sharing about that. And in that case, I purchased a brand sponsored collaboration affiliation template from a lawyer. It was cheaper than actually hiring a lawyer to write one for me, and it fit exactly what I needed. And I wanted to make sure that it was from a lawyer, not just some random template on the internet, because you never know. People have come after me before for leaving negative reviews publicly. What is your why that got you interested and passionate about sourdough? I wish I had like a really sweet story, but the honest truth is I have a problem with hobbies. I think it's potentially a symptom of my ADHD because I hear a lot of other people talking about this specific to ADHD, but I have an issue where I see someone doing a hobby and I get very inspired, like hyper focused, inspired. I'm going to purchase everything that I need to do that hobby, and I'm starting it tomorrow. And I've been like this my entire life. I can just put a list up here of the many hobbies that my poor husband has supported me in doing. I spent so much money on things that I was so amped up about, and then I started doing it and just lost interest. And I honestly thought sourdough was going to be that. I got really inspired watching people make it online, and it was at a time where I needed something. Sourdough is very therapeutic. I needed that at that time. And I thought, this is really cool, and I'm actually going to be sad when I lose interest in it because I know myself. And my husband did too, but he was still like, buy the Bannetons, it's fine. But I've never lost interest. In fact, I just keep getting more and more passionate about it, and it's all I ever think about. Is it an obsession? Maybe. I don't know. But I think what draws me to sourdough and keeps me interested in it is the complexity of it. It is the deepest rabbit hole ever, and I love learning. I am a lifelong learner. And if I am faced with a challenge, I'm not going to stop until I figure it out. And sourdough is the ultimate challenge. So that's my why. And if I find something that was helpful to me, all I want to do is share it with somebody. So I first was sharing it with my mom and my sister, but I think they got tired of the text because they're like, you don't really care about sourdough. Now my mom is making it, but at the time she was like, cool. So it made sense. I'm a blogger. So I was like, yeah, I'll just create an account and post about it. It would be fun. And here we are. What do you do for a living aside from sourdough blogs? I have a full-time job. I'm a content director for an insurance company. We also live on a horse farm, which has an Airbnb and a horse boarding side to it. Like, we don't train horses or anything. We just lease it out. I also have that other blog I mentioned, but I have not done any work on it really in the past 6 or 8 months because the sourdough has completely taken over my life. But I did have another blog. My bread rises beautifully, but no ear. How do I get an ear? It does look pretty in pictures, but practically speaking, it's kind of annoying to cut your bread or to just have this crusty sticking out bit on every slice. But some people do like it. And if you want to get an ear, you need to have properly fermented bread. Can't be too under or too overproofed, or it's not going to turn out the way that you want it. You want it to be very well fermented. And when you go to score it, you want to score at an angle. If you score straight down, you're not going to really get an ear. If you score at an angle, it will produce an ear. You can also increase your chances of having a nice big ear by doing what's called the 6-minute expansion score. In my oven, 6 minutes isn't long enough. My dough is still too doughy. I have to do like 8-9 minutes. So just experiment with your oven, but you basically take your bread out and you reinforce your score, but again, not straight down, at an angle. And you're almost going to score like right underneath the surface on the edge of your score. And that's going to help it pop up more while it's baking. If you're not getting an ear, don't think like, oh, my bread's not as good as it could be, because a lot of us purposefully score our bread differently to not get an ear. So don't worry about that. What else do you enjoy doing besides baking and sourdough? Honestly, sourdough has taken over the majority of my time and I love it, but it has gotten to the point where I do sometimes feel a little bit burnt out by it. So I have hired a productivity and time consultant that I'm meeting with starting in February. I'm very excited about that. And she's going to help me kind of remap out my day. She's going to help me outsource some things and kind of reclaim some of my time back. And once I get that time back, I really want to start reading again because I love reading. I'm an English major. Reading has always been my hobby of choice. And I have not had any time to do that since the sourdough started getting pretty intense as far as needing my time. How much flour do you go through in a week? I don't know about a week, but I do know about how often I send my husband to buy me a 50-pound bag of flour from the restaurant supply store. It's about once every 2 months. I go through about 6 pounds of flour a week. Sometimes it's a little bit more than that if I'm doing lots of experiments, or like that week that I made 6 loaves of bread for our teachers. I don't usually make 6 loaves of bread in a day. That's pretty excessive. So I think I sent my husband like 2 weeks earlier than normal to get me another bag. But in general, we go through about 6 pounds of flour a week, 5 to 6 pounds, which sounds like a lot. But there are 5 of us, and I do a lot of baking that I maybe wouldn't otherwise do because I'm doing experiments or creating sourdough content. Not too much more, actually. But sometimes I'll go out of my way to do something that I probably wouldn't have if I didn't have the blog. But anyway, I hope this Q&A was helpful. I will be doing this more often in the future. Thank you for being here. Happy baking.